Magic shall be written upon the sky by the rain, but they shall not be able to read it. Magic shall be written on the faces of the stony hills, but their minds shall not be able to contain it. Hello humans, my name is Dael Kingsmill. I'm back. I've been gone for a while. For people who don't know what's happened to me, SparkNotes version. I was invited to go and participate in D&D Live 2019. So then a bunch of work was happening in the lead up to that, and then by the time I had the confirmation and the ability to let people know that I was heading there, I was already like on a plane, so I didn't get to make a video beforehand. I tried, I'm very sorry. That was super exciting. I got to play in a game of Death Race to sort of celebrate the Descent into Avernus release. I got to play with James Hake, one of the designers. Adam Lee was our DM, the McElroys, Clinton Travis McElroy. Thrilling stuff. If you missed it, I'll put a link in the description below so you can watch that. Just saying, my character's name was Carapace Tomahawk, and I kinda came up with it on the fly, and I'm very proud of myself. I had a great time. I met a lot of people that I really like. I got to hang out with Matt and the Colvilles at MCDM again, which is just the best because they're the most lovely people. But I'm back now. I've been gone for a month and I'm back now. And we are talking about D&D. What specifically? Well, let me tell you right now one time. I've been asked a few times by people, most recently by Dorian Chin on Twitter, how to handle the Feywild in your game. The basis of the question is because people know that I'm into mythology and folklore and those sorts of things, so I've read up on a lot of what we call source material. And so people are like, what's going to be a more accurate depiction of the Feywild? But it is a tricky question. It's tricky for a couple of reasons. It's tricky because ultimately your version of the Feywild should match your game, and me talking about it, it's only really going to match mine. And I think a big thing is that it's tricky because we're trying to mechanically define something which is kind of naturally, inherently, these words feel wrong, but something that is indefinite, and we're trying to like pin rules down that will make it feel like this thing. And that's fairly antithetical, you get what I'm saying. But vague and evocative is what we do here, so let's try to talk this through anyway. I haven't super structured the idea of this video, so just bear with me. I don't know, we'll probably go through a couple different phases. I want to start out though by reading through a couple of things from C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy, and Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. Because what we're looking for when we talk about Faerie as a place, and I will almost inevitably refer to it as Faerie rather than the Feywild, you'll have to excuse me. We're looking for that feeling of magic that is kind of this deep, innate, it's like that thing that makes your skin prickle, that affective pre-language response to something. Like that feeling when you're outside at night and the wind blows from just the wrong direction and you have this like overwhelming urge to run inside, or that kind of melancholic joy and sadness that comes over you if you're like looking over a sweeping vista. That's the kind of feeling that we're talking about. And Lewis and Tolkien both kind of speak on those things. So I'm gonna be a full-on nerd and read you some quotes from some essays. What I had read, says Lewis, was the words Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. What I had seen was one of Arthur Rackham's illustrations to that volume. I actually have the Arthur Rackham Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods, because my parents rock. I'm gonna show you some pictures. This is what Lewis was talking about. I had never heard of Wagner nor of Siegfried. I thought the Twilight of the Gods meant the twilight in which the gods lived. How did I know at once and beyond question that this was no Celtic or Sylvan or terrestrial twilight? But so it was. Pure northernness engulfed me. A vision of huge, clear spaces hanging above the Atlantic in endless twilight of northern summer. Remoteness, severity, and almost at the same moment I knew that I had met this before, long, long ago. It hardly seems longer now, in Tegner's Drappa. That Siegfried, whatever it might be, belonged to the same world as Balder and the sunward sailing cranes. And with that plunge back into my own past, there rose at once, almost like heartbreak, the memory of joy itself. The knowledge that I had once had what I had now lacked for years, that I was returning at last from exile and desert lands to my own country, and the distance of the twilight of the gods and the distance of my own past joy, both unattainable, flowed together into a single, unendurable sense of desire and loss, which suddenly became one with the loss of the whole experience, which, as I now stared round the dusty schoolroom like a man recovering from unconsciousness, had already vanished, had eluded me at the very moment when I could first say, "It is." And at once I knew, with fatal knowledge, that to have it again was the supreme and only important object of desire. So this is Lewis, this is him talking about northernness, which I think is a very key thing to making something feel magic in a very sort of dense, sort of deep magic way. People have often asked me, is your setting high magic or low magic? And my answer is always very frustrating, I'm sure. My setting is pervasive magic. And I think that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about magic that is beyond, you know, the sort of zip-zap boing magic, beyond the sort of pencil-pushing academic, like we can find it, like structuralism kind of magic, something that is more earthy than that. Simultaneously earthy and alien. Does this make sense? Now, Tolkien, in On Fairy Stories, talks about a lot of different things, trying to define what makes fairies fairies. Fairy stories are not, in normal English usage, stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy. That is Faerie. The realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. Stories that are actually concerned primarily with fairies, that is, with creatures that might also in Middle English be called elves, are relatively rare, and as a rule, not very interesting. Most good fairy stories are about the adventures of men in the perilous realm, or upon its shadowy marches. Fairy itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic, but it is magic of a peculiar mood and power at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. Supernatural is a dangerous and difficult word in any of its senses, looser or stricter. But to fairies it can hardly be applied unless super is taken merely as a superlative prefix. For it is man who is, in contrast to fairies, supernatural, and often of diminutive stature, whereas they are natural, far more natural than he. I can remember my mother reading this to me when I was in like the 3rd or 4th grade, which I feel like explains a lot. Alright, so we've got a little bit of a basis for the way that I'm thinking about magic here. Minimum zip-zap boing, maximum perilous realms. Alright, so I want to try and split this up into different elements that you can think about while designing an adventure in the Feywild. First of all, I want to talk about getting in. Now, as it stands, rules as written, you have plane shift, a spell that lets you travel to another plane of existence, plane of fire, let's travel to hell for a little bit, visit Avernus. And this is, generally speaking, how one would get into the Feywild. But here's the thing. If we're talking about dominant tropes that appear within folklore that talks about the adventures of men on the borders of the perilous realms, we're looking at a profound sense of getting lost. It's kind of all concerned with liminal spaces and liminal times. It all ties back into that idea. We're dealing with twilights, we're dealing with midnights, we're dealing with solstices, we're dealing with Samhain, Halloween, we're dealing with the borders of forests, we're dealing with, cracks in walls, we're dealing with ruins, this is getting to be a very long list. Horizons, barriers, and in-betweens. That's kind of the space that we're inhabiting here. So if you think about these things, like you think about a ruin, right? This is something that is not wholly a building and is not wholly the wild. It's this thing that is trapped in between. We look at twilight, it's this thing that it's not nighttime, but it's not daytime. It's the transitional period in between. Being lost, to me, sits in that same space of liminality because it's kind of this thing where you're trapped in transit. And this is the space that we want to play in, right? So I think for me, a very key thing about Faerie as a place is that it should be very difficult to get there on purpose. There are many, many folk tales that talk about sort of people Christians or mortal men, and their interactions with the Fae, and usually they come as someone has, gotten lost in the forest or forgotten, they've lost track of time. Some great examples I like to go to are The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis. It's one of the Narnia books. At the very beginning of it, Eustace and Jill Jill's being bullied. It's Eustace goes to talk to her, and they decide that they should go to Narnia, but they don't quite know how to get there, so they try to enact some ritual to call Aslan to take them to Narnia. But it doesn't work. The only way that it works is when the bullies come back around and the two of them run, and they run through some bushes and they're trying to get away, and they try this door to see if it'll open, and it opens up, but it opens up into Narnia because it was when they weren't trying to get there that they were able to enter. Actually, same thing with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's when Lucy or her siblings at various points are hiding in the cupboard that they accidentally fall through into Narnia. When Lucy tries to show her siblings, look, I found a magical place, the back of the wardrobe is there, right? This is what we're thinking about. If you're trying to do it on purpose, Faerie's not as likely to let you enter. Suggestions for how people can enter if they're specifically given like a task to complete in the Feywild. This can be a whole thing that they have to investigate how to get there themselves. I would say that it's much easier during things like solstices, because these are those transitional points. These are the in-betweens. These are the times when the veil is thinnest. On top of that, dusk, dawn, midnight. Play with those times. Maybe you can only enter at those times. What are some other cool things that you could do with it? You could play with the idea of horizons or vanishing islands, which show up frequently in fairy stories. In fact, the idea of traveling to Hades in Greek mythology as well. You just travel into the west until eventually you reach the horizon and you'll end up in Hades. Or sometimes you have to swim to the bottom of a lake, There are obviously places where the veil is thin. You can play with those ideas, and times when the veil is thin. Look at those in-betweens, look at those, in-betweens again. In-between places, in-between times. Maybe look at the idea of places where the wild is reclaiming civilization. That idea I mentioned of the gap in the wall, like in Stardust, you've got this thing, this built structure, but here where it's broken down, here where civilization is collapsing a little bit, that's where you can break in, that's where you can get into this other realm. So for me, that would be probably step one. It should not be easy to enter into the Feywild. Phase 2, how do we make it feel like it's the Feywild while your players are there? How do we describe something like this when it's conceptual, not logical? I would say again, we're still playing with those liminal elements, and we're playing with the conceptual, not the logical. So I would do things like I would take points of bearing that we would usually have in the real world, and we would make them stop working. So time, space, direction, those sorts of things. You can keep walking north, but you will loop around. It doesn't matter. If someone has, whatever that feat is that lets you always know what way is north, their ability is still working. They can still tell what way is north, but no matter what they do, they can keep walking in circles, because Feywild doesn't work like our world does. It just doesn't. Those ideas of eternal twilight, those ideas of a horizon that you can never reach. In my setting, I have the Feyacre. I don't remember how much I've talked about this before and how much I have not. The Feyacre is a place where it is known that the veil is quite thin between in my setting, the Feyacre and the real world. And I had a moment when the players, Bryn Olden, a city nearby the Feyacre, probably closest to the border of this sort of mountainous forest region, my players went to the top of this hill and they look out over the Feyacre, and it's tricky to describe because they're looking out over it and they can see that it's forests and mountains, and they look up, they're looking for the horizon. And they can tell that there is one, but as they lift their eyes never reach the horizon. It just keeps, the Feyacre just keeps on going. And that was a signal of mine to say that, A, this is, a different dimension almost, but also B, talking about this idea of, because in my setting, the different planes kind of just overlap over the material plane. They're all kind of all the same place. And part of that thing with the Feyacre is that if you were traveling through the forest from the other side, you'd get through no problem. But if you're traveling going south to north, you'll never make it through. You will never make it through. You'll either end up in the Feyacre or you'll end up looping in the same part of the forest over and over and over again. So I would recommend mentioning stuff about, you know, if people have traveled for a while, mention the same kind of indicator of time. You know, if it's been the sunset, then wait a couple of hours, like they set up camp or whatever, mention that the sun is still setting, then later on mention that the sun is still setting, things like this. Like, just take the stuff that people take for granted as how they sort of grasp what's going on around them, and just mess with it. Not in huge dramatic ways, just in little ways. Ooh. Remember how dreams work? How you can like travel, like you can be at school and then the next thing you know you're at work, but your brain doesn't question it. Like, you walked through this one door and you're just like, yeah, of course this makes sense now. And it's not like there's necessarily been a time skip. You're just like, this is of course how space works. That kind of a thing would be a cool thing to play with. Now, the denizens of Faerie. Fairies, some might call them. I think it's tricky to walk that line between, you know, your Tinkerbells versus looking into it more and going, ooh, fairies are malicious. Because I don't think either feels quite right for me, at the very least. Again, I'm gonna draw pretty heavily, I think, from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell for this particular section, because for me it nails the idea of fairies just being so alien to humanity. So here's a quote from that. Men and fairies both contain within them a faculty of reason and a faculty of magic. In men, reason is strong and magic is weak. With fairies, it is the other way round. Magic comes very naturally to them, but by human standards, they are barely sane. I find it helpful to think about this. There's that philosophical idea on morality that animals cannot be good or bad. They can't be good or evil or wicked or any of those things, because an animal doesn't apply our human sense of morality to its actions. You know, it's not evil for a killer whale to play with a half-dead seal for an hour or whatever, even though from our perspective, we're looking at that going, that is friggin' cruel. Killer whale doesn't have a concept of cruel. Killer whale doesn't have a concept of good and bad. The killer whale is just a killer whale. Similar thing with fairies. They are clever, but they do not think like we do. I think this is the most important thing to play with if you're going to have Fae characters show up for your PCs to deal with, because we need to remember that they are hyper-fixated, very highly concerned with propriety and decorum, but not so concerned with right versus wrong. They don't see any problem with kidnapping a baby and replacing it with a rotting log that looks like the baby, but they do see a problem with you, like, I don't know, using the wrong salad fork, right? If you don't behave in a way that they deem polite, they will be highly offended, and then because of this other aspect, the right and wrong aspect, they'll be like, it's fine to kill you for not being polite. See what I mean? It's like, whoa! So how can we play some fairies? How can we play with those elements in order to make it convincing? Alright, vague and evocative, let's do this. Again, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, aesthetically and in terms of the sound of things, does a really great job. So here are some fairy names from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. You've got Cold Henry, John Hollyshoes, the Lady of the Castle of the Plucked Eye and Heart, Cold Tom Blue, Dick Come Tuesday, Master Fallowthought. You see how a lot of these are playing with ideas of things that are so totally not human at the same time as things that are very mundane. Cold Henry. That it gives this simultaneous thing of like, here's just a name, Henry, but Cold Henry. It's got that same thing as Jack Frost. It's got that same thing as, I don't know, the Fisher King, the Green Man of the Forest. You've got these names that are like full strings of words, full sentences, or descriptions of what a person looks like. Well, not a person. And it all kind of works together to give you this idea of this is a name that's been kind of applied to them from the outside, because we don't know a fairy's name. Let's remember that. We don't know a fairy's name. So these are just names that kind of form over time from different perspectives. They'll have multiple names. They come from things they do and places that they inhabit and all sorts of things like that. The idea of place names in Faerie as well. Lost Hope, Pity Me, Untold Blessings, the City of Iron Angels, the Blue Castles. Again, it's emotional and conceptual more than it is logical. You know, mortals tend to name places after the geography that was there or the people that were there before we started building a town, right? We call things, I don't know, Beacon Hill, because there was a beacon on the hill and then we built a town around it, and so the place is called Beacon Hill. But this, Lost Hope, it's so alien, it's so different to the way that we give things names. I mean, that argument falls apart a little bit because apparently Pity Me is the name of several towns in northern England, so I'm not saying fairies, but fairies. Oh, look at this again. The description of Untold Blessings as a place is a fine place with dark, impenetrable forests, lonely mountains, and uncrossable seas. There's that thing again, that sort of, that longing, melancholic desire that comes with the sort of capital R romance of human interactions with nature in the natural world. When speaking visually of Fae, I think it's interesting to deal in things that again are emotional and conceptual, vague and evocative, things that you can't picture but you still get it. Here's a great description from Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Seriously, read it if you haven't, because I like it a lot. A lady was standing close by. She wore a gown the color of storms, shadows, and rain, and a necklace of broken promises and regrets. A necklace of broken promises and regrets. Like, you get it. You can't picture it, but you get it, though. Her name throughout the rest of this section, by the way, becomes the lady in the gown the color of storms, shadows, and rain. Use the language of ideas to put non-pictures in people's heads. Is that useful as a sentence? I don't think it could be. And finally, let's talk about getting out. Even more so than getting into Faerie, I think getting out should be very difficult. Especially once you've started to cross paths with Fae. If someone gets into Faerie by getting lost and accidentally stumbling in, it's much more difficult to get lost and stumble home again. The benevolence of a fairy might take you home. I think your best bet again is gonna be things like doorways. Did I mention doorways amongst my horizons list? Doorways are great, but the trickiest thing is gonna be stuff like, did your players engage in a dance? Did your players eat some food? Did your play, all these classic tropes of don't do this thing in Faerie. Did your players take something that it belongs to the realm of Faerie? Not something stolen. I feel like you can take things that Faerie stole back to the mortal realm, but like a thing that is of Faerie, trying to pull it out. The way that you're gonna get out of Faerie is like turning down invitations, being very polite. You know what's a good way to get out of Faerie is just to sit down and stay still until morning. There are these great stories of, like, there's a field in Ireland that I think one of the lecturers at my uni talks about near his place, where they just know, don't walk through that field after dusk, don't walk through that field at nighttime. You will be lost the whole night. Like, no matter how far you walk, no matter what direction you go, you will be lost until morning, at which point it'll be very easy to cross that field. Don't eat any food that fairies have grown. Don't accept offers to stay at their place. Try not to dance with them. If you are gonna dance with them, make sure that you have a buddy to pull you out of the fairy ring when it gets to be more than 10 minutes. Otherwise, you will have been there for 7 to 100 years. I think what all of this is coming down to is that while you might be able to, like, trick an individual fairy, while you might be able to capture and utilize the power of an individual fairy as a place, you should not be able to overpower, and you should not be able to trick. And the magic shouldn't be a thing that you can control, it should be a thing that overwhelms you and you just have to go with, like a big ol' raging river. Something that I feel is worth mentioning also, I think the role of cold iron should be limited to a degree if you're dealing with something like the Feywild. I think maybe you could say that a fairy that comes into the mortal realms, you can go ahead and fight it like anything else with cold iron. But yeah, I don't know, the idea of going into the realm of Faerie and saying, I can just kill this like I would kill a monkey. Why did I pick a monkey? That was weird. It seems antithetical to the whole concept of trying to make this place feel like this alien, indefinable, magical thing. Alright, I don't know if any of that was technically useful to you, so here are my recommendations for reading. Ow, I tripped over. I tripped over my Dael toy. Tolkien, on fairy stories. Lewis, Surprised by Joy. Susanna Clarke, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, It takes a while to get going, but boy, oh boy, once it goes, does it go. W.B. Yeats on, this is Irish Fairy and Folk Tales. This is a collection of actual Irish fairy and folk tales. Some great stuff in here. It's all kind of a combination. It's, you know, ghosts, witches, fae, all sorts. Mary Stewart, the Crystal Cave, the Hollow Hills, etc. The Merlin series. I'm dropping things. Fairies, Brian Froud and Alan Lee. This one is great because it's like, it started out as kind of an art project, and they actually both cared enough about fairies to go in and do a ton of research, and so it's all like super cool stuff, and it's super pretty. Ooh, I flagged a thing here. What did I flag? Fairies are alien creatures with values and ethics far removed from mankind. They do not think, and most notably, they do not feel the way that humans do. See, that seems like a good note to end on. If I think of more books to recommend, I will leave them on my Reddit or something. This was a definitely vague and evocative video, but hopefully you found some ideas that are inspiring. I'm glad to be back making videos. I feel like there's something I'm forgetting to say, something important. Well, can't think of it right now, so apart from that, I do believe that's it. I'm done. Email this to your grandma. I will see you some other time. These here are overalls I got from Holland as a gift for being a guest. How insane is that?